I'd also like to thank you very much for the opportunity to be here, and particularly to Eric for ongoing conversations, including my first meeting of the AERC was very much under his influence. And this title was given to me, and so I had to come up with something to say, and it's been a fascinating journey. So what I'd like to do is, building on what James has said, just give you one case study, in a sense, from the Global Multidimensional Poverty Index for some countries in Africa. Not because the global MPI is the right measure for many countries, not because it's the best possible measure. Indeed, it's very data constrained and very crude, and will be inaccurate for some ethnic groups in some climactic conditions, and in details of different data sets. But what I'd like is really for you to then have an illustration of how these methods can be used, and perhaps also how they could be linked with the main theme of this conference, which is growth, and with some other interesting research topics. So the global MPI uses demographic and health surveys, and I will restrict myself in today's presentation to data from those surveys because they are the most comparable across countries, as well as mix for 30 countries and WHS for 17 and 6 national surveys. And the household is the unit of analysis, in a sense that you are looking at the overlapping deprivations that are experienced at the household level. That was driven by the data that we had. We could not go to the individual level, so we cannot look at gender or at age or other relevant features given the data sets that we have. So just to explain a little bit about using the household as a unit of analysis. When there are individual data, as there are for health or education, you have to think about a household cutoff. So in the case of the MPI, the household is identified, and every member in the household is deprived in nutrition if any member in the household, adult or child, is undernourished. The household, every member is deprived in child mortality if any child has died in your household. You are deprived in years of schooling if nobody in your household has 5 years of schooling, because there are shared effects of having one literate, educated person within the household. And the whole household is deprived if no child is attending school to the age at which they would complete class 8. So these are the dimensions, weights, and indicators of the global MPI, but they were generated for the UNDP with one purpose: to provide a crude illustrative measure that covered more than 100 countries. There are many dimensions we would have wished to put in, such as work, empowerment, personal security, and perhaps income or consumption. But these data were not present and accurate in the surveys that we had. And recall, we're looking at the joint distribution of deprivations. So we needed all variables from the same surveys. So that's the rationale for this. And it is also the rationale for our ease at admitting these are not the best indicators. Others should go in, and we would like them to. And that requires better survey data. So I echo James's call for consideration of the survey. So if a person is only deprived in nutrition, it may not be that they are poor. They might have a physical condition, or they might be a fashion model. It might be a fashion choice. If they are deprived in sanitation, they might not consider that in their ethnic community to signify poverty. And similarly, they may not have electricity, but our survey does not have information on whether they have other ways of coping. And cooking fuel, we don't have information on chimney. So a single deprivation, if we look at measurement errors alone, is not going to be sufficient to indicate poverty. And further, there might be normative arguments to say that the people who really have multiple deprivations should arguably be the focal population. And so people are deprived if they are, people are poor if they are deprived in 1/3 of the dimensions. And from that, the MPI is constructed. So I'm going to focus on the 12 countries, but just to give you a bit of the overview, In the 5.4 billion people that we covered this year in the results released March 14th by the UNDP in the Human Development Report 2013, 29% of those people live in sub-Saharan Africa. And then we also have, for example, Tunisia or Egypt or Somalia, Morocco in what is termed Arab states. And also this finding that we had last year is replicated in this year's data that 72% of the poor live in middle-income countries. And just so that you see all of the countries on one diagram, these are the countries from the lowest headcount of 0% in Slovakia or Slovenia to the highest headcount of 92% in Niger. And the height is the intensity, the average intensity that the poor persons in that country experience. So in the low incidence countries, every poor person is deprived in fewer indicators simultaneously than in the poorest countries, where not only are more people deprived, poor, but each poor person is deprived in more indicators at the same time. I'll be using these words again and again as we talk about reducing poverty, reducing intensity and headcount. The color of the balls is the income category, with Tajikistan having 4.8%, Kyrgyzstan having 4.9% people who are poor, being a low-income country, and a country like Angola, which is a middle-income country, having 77% of people who are poor. So although we're not talking about growth today or even levels of income, there is variety among the groups. And as James already mentioned, we don't have $1.25 a day poverty from data within 3 years of the MPI for many countries, but we do for just over 70 countries. And we can compare the head count, so the percentage of people who are multidimensionally poor, and the percentage of people who are $1.25 a day poor. And I'll show some changes over time. So that's the background. And what I will now do for the remaining time is focus on 12 countries, which are the African countries for which we have changes over time from demographic and health surveys in 2 periods. And first of all, just to give you an overview of these countries, the head count ranges from 31% in Ghana to 87.3% in Ethiopia. The intensity is between 44 and 65%. And the most recent year of the survey is 2008 to 2011. We have, and you can't see the numbers, but just to tell you, we also have the $1.25 a day values. But I must say that only 4 of the 12 countries have $1.25 a day data from 2008 to 11. And the remaining countries have data from 2003 to 2007. But there are interesting comparisons to do just in a very descriptive way. But our focal question is, how did multidimensional poverty change over time? And how could the numbers that simply describe that change then be linked with other kinds of poverty analysis, whether these are monitoring, whether these are evaluation, whether these are growth? So this chart simply shows the initial MPI in the light bar values and the subsequent one in the dark bar. And so you can see that Ethiopia is the poorest country. We have 2 periods of time for Ethiopia, 2000 to 2005 and 2005 to 2011. And the least poor country in Africa in the second period was Zimbabwe, and following that Lesotho. Of the 22 countries which we covered, 18 of them have statistically significant MPI reductions, and all of them, except for Madagascar in Africa, have statistically significant reductions in MPI over their relevant time periods. The shortest time period is Tanzania, only 3 years, and the longer time periods are 6 or 7 years. We, from this point on, only present annualized changes so that they are strictly comparable. And I should also say that in order to have comparable changes over time, we also harmonized every indicator definition very, very tightly because the nutrition subsamples, for example, changed in the DHS surveys. So the indicators have been specifically analyzed, and there are tables about how that's done if people are interested. We have not, at this point, completed the robustness analysis. It is ongoing. But what we always do is we always compute the MPI for every single poverty cutoff, not just for the 33% value that we report and the statistical significance of which we report, but for all poverty cutoffs as well as for other parameter choices. And show the changes. And we do this not only at the national level, for example, for Rwanda, but also at the subnational levels. And so all of these data are available, but I won't dwell on them further. So how fast did the countries change? The length of the bar is the annualized rate of change in MPI over time. So Rwanda had the fastest annual rate of change and absolute annualized rate of change. And Ghana and Tanzania also had very, very strong rates. And the remaining African countries, as you can see, are among the faster reducers, with Zimbabwe being the slowest. And Madagascar at the top is the one outlier of that trend. Now, naturally, for countries with very low initial rates of poverty, such as Colombia, the absolute rate cannot be high. And so in that case, it's more appropriate to compare relative rates of reduction. We have those tables online. How does this rate of MPI reduction compare to the rate of reduction of $1.25 a day? Just very briefly, that's a hard question because we don't have data from the same surveys. So we've done linear extrapolations between the income poverty data, and we could do that for 17 periods. I can go into exactly how we did that. And then we compared with the dark bar being the rate of reduction of the headcount of MPI and the light bar, the income poverty headcount. 5 of the 6 African countries for which we have income data had a faster reduction of the headcount of MPI over that period. And the one that did not was Ethiopia, sorry. And Madagascar had an increase in both. You could think of comparing the rate of reduction of MPI and poverty gap, but I'm uncertain enough about that not to present the results, although we've calculated them. Now, how did this reduction take place? For example, one of the motivations of the FGT was to draw policymakers' attention not only to the people barely below the poverty line, but to those whose gap was significant, and look at the reduction in the gap as well as the reduction in the headcount. And so we might say similarly, to what extent was the reduction in MPI driven by a reduction in incidence or driven by a reduction in intensity? And we've plotted the countries here, and you can see that Rwanda had a very balanced reduction in both, as did Tanzania. That Ethiopia basically reduced intensity the most, and Nigeria basically reduced incidence. So there are different patterns of reduction of MPI. When you reduce intensity, then it means that perhaps still a large percentage of people are poor, and in the past 6-year period, incidence in Ethiopia went down by simply a couple percent, but that each poor person is on average deprived in fewer dimensions at the same time. So it's very, very important to capture that change. It's also important to point out to countries the importance of having, in a sense, a focus on the deeply poor. For example, if Ghana had had the same reduction of intensity of poverty as Rwanda, it also would have been the #1 country, or Malawi and Ethiopia. So it's important perhaps to discuss those so that the policies don't focus simply on one or the other. And it's also important to just point out the difference. So Rwanda, Ethiopia, and Nigeria, they all reduced MPI, that's the annualized rate of reduction. But in Ethiopia, more than half of the change was due to reduction in intensity. In Nigeria, only 6%. In Rwanda, 1/3. And among the fast-performing countries, they all had a relatively balanced 1/3 of intensity and 2/3 of headcount reduction. So that's all of the countries. And you can see that the fast performers did reduce intensity as well as incidence. Okay, so that's simple patterns of change. But as James mentioned, one of the values of this very simple way of measuring poverty is that after identifying the poor and censoring the deprivations of the non-poor, you can break it down by each of the 10 indicators and see, in a sense, how poverty changed. So here are 4 countries and the 10 indicators, and it is showing the annualized percentage of people whose deprivation was reduced in that indicator. So for example, in Rwanda, you can see that nutrition, child mortality, years of schooling, and school attendance were all reduced by approximately the same amount, and those are the highest weighted indicators, and that there was a very strong reduction in sanitation and water. And you can see that there is no one pattern either across the countries, that each of the 10 indicators was reduced, so there's no pure stock variable, which we didn't know when we started. We thought child mortality might be too much of a stock, or flooring, or years of schooling. And you can also see that the patterns certainly are different, with much lower reduction of malnutrition. For example, in Uganda, we don't have malnutrition data in Tanzania. And these are, again, other countries, Zimbabwe, Madagascar, Lesotho. So it's just to say that understanding this is perhaps quite useful for looking at the different sectoral policies and joined-up coordinated response, whether it's integrated village development programs or something else. A tiny analytical footnote. For those who are doing in-depth country studies, it is always useful to compare the reductions among the poor with the reductions that are population-wide, because some reductions might push a person out of poverty, but they might retain this deprivation when they move to the non-poor, and also some rates of reduction might be higher among the poor than they are in society as a whole. And so these show what we call the raw head count is the population-wide deprivation, so the percentage of people in the population who have lost a child in their family, and this is the percentage of poor people who have, the rate of reduction in the percentage of households who have lost a child in the 2 poor and society-wide populations. And so that's important analytically. And the final point, I think I only have a few minutes left, is to look beneath the nation state. I will present regional disaggregations. It could be by ethnicity, it could be by religion, by whatever variable the data is representative by. And if the measure is generated for individuals, it could be, as I said, by gender, by age, by occupation or other characteristics. So for each of the countries, and these are all online, we have the regions of the countries, the MPIs of the regions, the head count, the intensity, and the rates of change. I won't bore you with much, but just to show that, for example, in Tanzania, Zanzibar had very significant reductions at alpha equals 0.1 and 0.01, sorry, and that Zanzibar is not the poorest region. If we look at the MPI of 0.267, the poorest region is Lake. But we see differences. For example, the second poorest region in Lesotho, Kacha's Neck, had the fastest reduction of MPI. Or in Madagascar, where poverty was not statistically different between the 2 periods. There were changes, one up and one down at the regional, subnational region level. In Malawi, as in Rwanda, as in Bangladesh, every region had statistically significant reductions in poverty. And the rates varied a lot. So in Zimbabwe, Masvingo had a rate that was twice as fast of reduction as the national average. And similarly, finally, and I'm not going to expect you to see all this, this is my last slide on the MPI, or last slides. We can, again, go at the regional level, because often policies are made at the province, at the state, at the regional level, whatever level the data is representative by, and look at the change in composition. I put Bolivia, up, because it's actually quite a similar pattern at different rates across the regions. Whereas if you look at Uganda, there are actually quite different patterns of reduction in MPI across the different regions of Uganda. So this again can add information to the pot. So what I've tried to do is, in a sense, just give you a taster. You are the experts rather than me in what lies behind this work. But from a measurement perspective, using the very crude and admittedly flawed measures such as the MPI, we could see that across the African countries, all but Madagascar reduced MPI. The starting levels, or the reduction levels, varied a lot, and the starting levels of poverty varied from over threefold, with the lowest Ghana 0.144 and the highest Ethiopia 0.56. The rates of MPI reduction also varied, but in 5 of the 6 countries for which we have data, so this is not representative, it's simply illustrative, the rate of reduction of MPI was faster than $1.25 a day, but you must bear in mind that on average, the headcount of MPI is also greater than the headcount of 125, though that varies. And that some countries had greater reduction of intensity than others, and also the patterns of reduction of indicators varied nationally and subnationally. So what are the kinds of real research, in a sense, that this documentation of measurement could usefully interface with? How could it be taken forward? One is there will be a ginormous amount of data. We'll have to update it this year. Last year it was like 20 countries we updated. This year it'll be up to 70, depending when they're actually made public. And then clearly there need to be analyses with growth, as this conference has documented, and policy analyses when you can find natural experiments using the subnational data. Looking at macro determinants of MPI reduction, decompositions by ethnic and religious groups, more analyses of income and MPI. We look in, for example, at how monetary poverty works with household size. There is clearly the largest households are poorest, whereas with MPI, that's not always the case. And also where you have data sets that have both income data or consumption data and the indicators for an MPI, looking at, in a sense, the crosstabs, the associations and the matches between different definitions of poverty. We had a workshop on this in November, and Sebastian Levine was due to present his updated paper today from that workshop, and he was using the DHS HICE dataset in Uganda. But there are many countries in which the match between people who were actually identified as MPI poor and as income poor was quite low. And then there are a range of policy questions that James gestured to. Perhaps what better data would one want, and how could one get it so that it was not so data constrained. And also much more interesting are the national poverty measures, which can really reflect both the policy priorities and the poverty conditions and values at the national level, and can become official statistics. So that's what I wanted to share. The tables that I presented are available online at the moment, all of them except for the indicators by subnational region, which we are still cleaning, but they will be up within a week or two. And so this is available to you if it would be of any use to take it further, because we are a small group and we really value suggestion and interchange, as well as people going ahead in ways we cannot or don't have the background at the country level to do. Thank you.